Hello. I thought I'd read a little bit today. One of my favorite books, The Language of Emotions. I think sometimes if I only had one book to take with me, this might be one of the books. I keep coming back to it again and again. The subtitle, What Your Feelings Are Trying to Tell You. And, from time to time I'll go and look at different emotions and kind of do a little study on the different categories of emotions that Carla McLaren has defined anyway. And her model, I think, is very helpful. And I wish this is a book that I'd read and come upon, if it were possible, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. That would have been a very helpful thing. But here we are today. This is from the section on grief, which I've been looking at. And I'm going to read a little bit of it. I'm just going to drop in the middle of it, of this chapter, so there might be some terms that, phrases, ideas that you're not familiar with, but you'll get the gist of it. Now that I look back on my life, I see that my decades-long unwillingness to cry and grieve was my way to keep the dead alive. It was my way to stop death in its tracks. I thought this made me stronger, more spiritual, or more evolved than other people. It didn't. It just trapped me in an immature and unbalanced relationship with true loss and death. I was all intellect and vision, all air and fire. I could describe death, I could pontificate about death, and I could fly above death. But I couldn't feel death in my heart, and my bend in the river of all souls was devastated by drought. When I finally learned how to grieve in my 30s, the river began to flow again, and I felt my grandparents and all the ungrieved people and animals inside me breathe a communal sigh of relief as they finally resumed their journeys into the next world. My dearly departed couldn't take their rightful places on the other side of the river, as ancestors, as wisdom holders, and as supports for me, because I had trapped them in another world by refusing to get into my body and grieve. If you're a primarily intellectual person, and this talk of spirits and the other world sounds like gibberish to you, think of it this way. If you don't grieve your losses, the people who have died either get erased from your consciousness as if they were unimportant, or they hang around in your psyche as if you're being haunted. Neither position is honorable or logical. It's important to honor your departed person's life and truly let them go so that you can live more fully, integrate your losses, and deepen as a person. This is also true for experiences or situations in which you lose something irretrievably. Thinking about it and intellectually releasing it is a good first step, but the real, fully human next step is to grieve properly. The logical intellect and the visionary spirit can't possibly dive down underneath life in the way that the body and the emotions can. They just can't because it's not in their nature. Both the intellect and the visionary spirit like to soar above and around life, and they don't understand the need to drop down into life. Grief, however, powerfully overrides the need to fly above or oversee or describe the process of death. Grief asks us to wade right in and sink down under the water. If we don't sink into grief, we can't connect properly to death or take our places in its sacred and necessary rituals. In many indigenous traditions, it's known that serious public grieving helps the dead cross over into the next world. The sounds of wailing are said to alert the ancestors to the death and to create a pathway for the departed souls to follow if they get confused or lost. These stories tell us that if we living people don't cry and genuinely mourn our losses, the dead won't realize what happened. In the spirit world, the ancestors won't be properly alerted. If we don't get into the river and mourn, there won't be enough water in the river, which means the dead won't be able to cross into the next world and become ancestors themselves. We, the living, help transport the dead to the next world through the quality of our grief and the quantity of our tears. If grieving is necessary and sacred, then what a terrible legacy we create for ourselves and our dead in our grief-impaired culture. which we move dead bodies into boxes and urns and gather quietly in our somber outfits around tables full of food. We tell each other it was all for the best, or that little Bobby is in a better world now. Our minds devise perfect explanations. Our spirits imagine the departed in heaven or nirvana. Our feelings are anesthetized. Our bodies are uninhibited, and we hold up very well. Uninhabited, that is. Our bodies are uninhabited, and we, quote, hold up very well. What an amazingly accurate description of grief impairment. When we see someone actively dropping into grief and mourning, we often turn away. It's embarrassing, it's frightening, it's distasteful, it's just not done. We turn away from the grief around us because we don't want to feel anything that deeply. It's too threatening, so we straighten our clothing and turn away. And that's the real death, of compassion, of community, of feeling, and of understanding. When we don't allow ourselves to grieve, we're repeatedly traumatized by death. When we refuse to feel the pain of loss, we refuse to honor our connections. We trick ourselves into thinking that we can guard ourselves against all pain if we just refuse to grieve or think about or prepare for death. In that refusal, however, we make a deadly mistake. We move further and further away from ourselves. We fail to connect deeply to the people in our lives. We lose connection to the real flow of life, and we dry up inside because there's no one in the river to honor our lost loved ones or our lost dreams. Each death and each loss, because we don't feel it properly, just stacks itself on top of the last death or loss, like papers on a disorganized desk, until we're filled with unfelt, unlived, unresolved deaths. I watch people who respond to death by making death unreal and grief unnecessary, just as I once did. They rely heavily on their spiritual beliefs so that death doesn't touch them, or they hide in their intellects and create long, rambling stories about death and loss. After a while, they become numb and disconnected from the world. I see that numbing influence in fire-only metaphysical circles, where people eradicate their own empathy by explaining illness or poverty as the end results of improper thinking or incompetent prayer. This deadened mindset allows them to offer pontifications and admonishments instead of loving support or compassion to people in trouble. People with this cold-hearted, benumbed spirituality can't see troubles for what they truly are. They don't realize that pain, illness, trauma, and grief are natural and deeply meaningful processes, without which no true spiritual or moral evolution could ever occur. I see a similar numbness in air-only intellectual circles, especially in politics, where welfare moms and Mexican immigrants are blamed for their poverty, where sweatshops and maquiladoras, it's probably not the right pronunciation, are seen as unfortunate necessities in the competitive marketplace, where wars and torture are touted as necessary for the maintenance of democracy, where people of color are imprisoned and executed in inexcusably unequal numbers, where people use their brilliance to seduce the public into accepting the unacceptable in the name of progress, and where truly grievous actions occur unheeded and unmourned every hour of every day. I also see that numbing clearly reflected in our violent culture and our ridiculously violent entertainment. People blather on about violent entertainment, giving us a safe outlet for our violent impulses, but that's so wrong. What a violent movie, book, or game does is inure us to violence. When we choose to watch bludgeonings, shootings, knifings, rapes, and molestations over and over again, what we're actually doing is anesthetizing ourselves. Our culture-wide addiction to violent and absurdly sexualized entertainment hasn't given us any kind of outlet for our violent impulses. If it did, we'd have a less violent culture and less need for violent images, but we don't. The violence level in movies, books, popular music, and television keeps increasing as our ability to grieve keeps decreasing. You see, we're not flocking to violent entertainment in order to understand violence or our own impulses. True violence bears almost no resemblance to entertainment violence. Trust me on this. What we're doing is asking the entertainment industry to traumatize and re-traumatize us so that we can numb ourselves to pain, horror, and death. But it doesn't work because our grief still exists and still waits for us, no matter how much brutality or manipulative sexual behavior we gaze at. If we can awaken from this anesthetized stupor, we can reintegrate our psyches and finally connect to our true grief. If we can shake off our fiery or airy delusions and take off our brittle armor and wade into the waters of grief, we can finally become truly alive. When we sink down into the waters of grief, we'll certainly feel the pain of loss, but we'll also discover our sacred position in the dance of all souls. In indigenous wisdom traditions, it is known that if a culture doesn't properly grieve their loved ones into their death journeys, they cannot properly welcome their children into their life journeys. There is such poetic truth to that. When we can't grieve our deep losses and honor our dearly departed, we won't have ample room for our children, for the young souls in the world around us, or for the elders who are preparing for death. In America, this is certainly our current political and social situation. This was written several years ago, by the way. We don't feed or educate our youth competently. We don't welcome them properly, and we don't honor or protect our elders. We don't support them properly. If we could learn to fully grieve our losses and send our dearly departed to their proper places in the next world, we could learn to make room for new connections, new attachments, new loves, and new lives. We could make room for love and life in both worlds. A lot there to think about and feel too, and move and live with.